The morning my grandfather's will was read, I could feel Mrs. Henderson's eyes burning into the back of my head from her front porch across the street. She wasn't even trying to be subtle about it, rocking back and forth in that ancient wicker chair of hers, lemonade forgotten as she watched our driveway like it was primetime television. The rest of the neighborhood wasn't much better. Curtains twitching, dog walkers slowing their pace, and lawnmowers conveniently sputtering to a halt within earshot of our property. I couldn't really blame them. Grandpa Joe had been something of a local legend in our little corner of Connecticut, the kind of eccentric that small towns whisper about but secretly love. He lived in that sprawling Victorian on Maple Street for 60 years, and everyone just assumed I'd inherit it. After all, I was his only living relative. Instead, all I got was a battered brown suitcase that looked like it had survived both world wars. "That's it?" My voice cracked as Mr. Patterson, the family lawyer, handed me the suitcase. Its leather was worn smooth in places, the brass fixtures dulled with age. A faded tag dangled from the handle, my grandfather's spidery handwriting barely legible. "For Emma, when the time is right." Mr. Patterson adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and cleared his throat. "The house and all other assets have been donated to the local historical society, as per your grandfather's final wishes." He paused, eyes softening. "He was quite insistent about the suitcase, Miss Collins. Said you'd understand when you opened it." But I didn't understand. Not at all. I'd spent every summer with Grandpa Joe since I was 5, helping him tend his prized rose garden and listening to his stories about his days as a traveling salesman. The whispers started before I even made it to my car. Mrs. Henderson had already speed-dialed her way through half the neighborhood, I was sure. I could practically hear their voices. Poor Emma Collins, all that time playing nurse to the old man. And what does she get? Some worthless old luggage. I shoved the suitcase into my trunk harder than necessary, trying to ignore the hot tears pricking at my corners of my eyes. At 26, I should have been above caring what these people thought. But their judgment stung, especially since none of them knew the real reason I'd moved back home last year. It wasn't about the inheritance. It was because Grandpa Joe was the only one who'd understood when my carefully planned life in Boston had imploded, when my perfect fiancé turned out to be anything but. Back in my tiny rented apartment, I set the suitcase on my coffee table and just stared at it. The sun was setting, painting my living room walls in shades of amber, and somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed mournfully. It felt like one of those moments Grandpa Joe used to talk about, the quiet spaces between decisions where life holds its breath. The leather felt warm under my fingers as I traced the edges of the suitcase. There was something odd about its weight. Not quite heavy enough to be empty, but not as heavy as it should be given its size. The brass latches were stiff, protesting as I flipped them open. Inside, there was only a single envelope and what looked like an old leather-bound journal. The envelope contained a single sheet of paper, covered in Grandpa Joe's distinctive handwriting. "My dearest Emma, if you're reading this, then I've finally run out of stories to tell. But the biggest one, the one I've kept closest to my heart, is yours now. What you'll find in this suitcase isn't worth much to those who measure life in dollars and cents. To the right person, though, it's worth everything. Start with page 37 of the journal. And Emma, remember what I always told you about crossroads? Sometimes the best path is the one that scares you most. Love, Grandpa Joe." My hands trembled as I picked up the journal. The journal's pages were yellow with age, their edges soft and worn. I flipped to page 37, and a small key taped to the page caught my eye. Beneath it was a series of numbers, followed by what looked like a hand-drawn map. The entry itself began mid-sentence, as if Grandpa had been in such a hurry to write that he couldn't be bothered with proper beginnings. "Found it today, after all these years of searching. Never thought it would be hidden in plain sight, right here in town. Martha would laugh if she knew. She always said my treasure hunting would be the death of me. But this time, I've got proof. The question is, what to do with it." My heart began to race. What exactly had my grandfather discovered? I'd barely finished reading when my phone buzzed. A text from Mrs. Henderson's granddaughter, Katie. "Hey, Em, Gram wants to know if you need help sorting through your grandfather's things. She's worried about you being alone." Translation: she's dying to know what was in the suitcase. I ignored the message and turned back to the journal. The next few pages were filled with what looked like coordinates and cryptic notes about local landmarks. References to the old mill by the river kept appearing, along with something called the Society, and repeated mentions of a woman named Eleanor Pierce. The writing grew more urgent with each entry, the normally neat script becoming increasingly rushed and slanted. "The 15th of October, 1962 Eleanor came to warn me tonight. Says they're getting suspicious. I told her we should go public with everything, but she insists it's not safe. Not yet. The society has too much influence, too many ways to make problems disappear. For now, we'll do it her way. The truth will have to wait for the right time, the right person. I think I know who that person will be, though she hasn't been born yet. Martha says I'm being dramatic again. Maybe I am, but someone needs to know what really happened here. I sat back, my mind spinning. What had my grandfather gotten himself mixed up in? The key that had been taped to page 37 was small and ornate, the kind you might use for a safety deposit box. I held it up to the light, noticing an engraving. First National Bank of Milton, box 437. Milton. That was just 2 towns over. The bank was still there, though it had changed names at least 3 times since the 60s. I checked the time, 6:47 p.m. Too late to do anything about it tonight. A sharp knock at my door made me jump. Through the peephole, I saw Mrs. Henderson herself, holding what looked suspiciously like a sympathy casserole. Before I could decide whether to pretend I wasn't home, she knocked again. "Emma, dear." Mrs. Henderson's voice carried through the door. "I know you're in there. I saw your car. I brought dinner." With a sigh, I quickly shoved the journal and key into a kitchen drawer and opened the door. Mrs. Henderson bustled past me in a cloud of floral perfume, already talking. "Such a shame about the house, dear. We all thought Shirley Joe would. Well, never mind that now. The Historical Society. I mean, really, what was he thinking?" She set down her casserole and peered around my apartment with barely concealed curiosity. "In that old suitcase? Was there anything interesting inside?" Her attempt at casual questioning wasn't fooling anyone. "Just some old papers," I lied, moving to block her view of the coffee table where the suitcase still sat. "Family stuff, you know. Nothing valuable." "Oh." The disappointment in her voice was almost comical. "Well, if you need help going through anything." She trailed off hopefully. "Thanks, Mrs. Henderson. I appreciate the casserole, but I've got a headache coming on, and I should probably rest." She lingered in my doorway, clearly hoping I'd crack and reveal something juicy. "You know, your grandfather was quite close with my Harold back in the day. Used to spend hours talking about the old mill district. Such a shame when they tore it all down in '65. I froze. The mill district. Just like in the journal. After finally shooing Mrs. Henderson away, I retrieved the journal and spread out the hand-drawn map on my kitchen table. It showed the old mill district, but with details I'd never seen before. Tunnels and passages that shouldn't exist, marked with elaborate symbols and notes in my grandfather's handwriting. One location was circled repeatedly. EP's vault, lower level. Next to it was a small drawing of what looked like a keyhole, similar to the one on the key I'd found. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a neighborhood watch alert. Someone had reported suspicious activity around my building. I walked to the window and pulled back the curtain. 3 different neighbors quickly looked away. I barely slept that night, tossing and turning as my mind raced with possibilities. Around 3 a.m., I gave up and started researching. Eleanor Pierce, it turned out, had been quite prominent in town during the 60s. She'd owned most of the mill district before it was demolished, and there were rumors about why she'd sold it all so suddenly. The few photos I could find showed a striking woman with sharp eyes and an expression that suggested she didn't suffer fools gladly. She died in 1975, apparently leaving no heirs. The local paper's obituary was surprisingly brief for someone who'd once been so influential. But what caught my eye was her connection to something called the Milton Historical Preservation Society. The next morning, I walked into the First National Bank of Milton right as it opened. The young teller looked bored until I mentioned the safety deposit box. "Box 437? Her expression changed instantly. "One moment, please." She disappeared into the back and returned with an older man in an expensive suit. He introduced himself as Mr. Whitaker, the bank manager. "Miss Collins," he said, studying me carefully. "We've been expecting you. Your grandfather made arrangements for this some time ago. If you'll follow me?" The other customers watched curiously as he led me through a set of heavy doors and down to the vault level. The safety deposit box was larger than I'd expected. Mr. Whitaker inserted his key, then gestured for me to use mine. The lock turned with a satisfying click. "I'll give you some privacy," he said, stepping out. Inside the box was a thick manila envelope, another key, this one much older looking, and a stack of photographs. The top photo showed Grandpa Joe as a young man, standing with Eleanor Pierce in front of the mill. They were both smiling, but something about their posture suggested urgency. On the back was written, "The day we found it, 1962. I opened the envelope. Inside was a deed and what looked like architectural plans. The deed was for a piece of property I'd never heard of, dated 1962 and signed by Eleanor Pierce. But according to these papers, she hadn't sold the entire mill district back then. She'd kept one small portion, transferring ownership to a trust with very specific conditions. The architectural plans showed something underground, beneath where the old mill had stood. Notes in the margins mentioned a vault and what appeared to be a complex locking mechanism. My phone buzzed. Mrs. Henderson again. Emma dear, I noticed you leaving early. Everything all right? Harold always said your grandfather and Eleanor Pierce were up to something back then. I left the bank with my head spinning. The deed, photos, and plans were safely tucked into my bag, but their weight felt like it was pulling me down into the past. According to the documents, there was still a sealed underground chamber beneath the old mill site, now a rather neglected park on the edge of town. The property deed had transferred to me automatically upon Grandpa Joe's death through some complicated legal mechanism I didn't fully understand. But one thing was clear. Whatever was hidden below that park was now legally mine. I drove past the site on my way home. 3 of my neighbors were there, pretending to walk their dogs while watching my car. Back home, I spread everything out and tried to make sense of it all. The architectural plans showed an entrance hidden in what looked like an old drainage system. The vault itself was deeper, reinforced with something that had made Eleanor Pierce nervous enough to write "must protect at all costs" across the bottom of the page. A yellowed newspaper clipping fell out of the stack. The headline read, "Local historian questions mill demolition. Eleanor Pierce refuses comment." The article mentioned strange lights and suspicious activity in the weeks before the demolition was approved. I heard a car door slam outside. More neighbors arriving to watch my apartment. I waited until dark. The neighbors had finally given up their surveillance, probably heading home for dinner. I packed a backpack with a flashlight, the plans, and both keys. The old work boots I'd used while gardening with Grandpa were still in my closet. The park was deserted when I arrived, streetlights casting long shadows across the overgrown grass. According to the plans, the entrance should be near the remnants of the old foundation wall, hidden behind decades of vegetation. I found it exactly where the plans indicated. A rusted metal door set into the concrete, nearly invisible behind thick vines. The old key fit perfectly, though it took all my strength to turn it. The door opened with a groan that seemed to echo through the entire park. I froze, certain someone must have heard, but the night remained quiet except for distant traffic and crickets. The beam of my flashlight revealed a narrow passage leading down. The air that drifted up was cool and surprisingly dry, with a metallic tang that reminded me of old pennies. On the wall, I could just make out the same symbol that had been marked on Grandpa's map. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. All those summers listening to Grandpa's stories, and he'd never once hinted at this. The passage sloped downward, concrete giving way to older stonework. My flashlight beam caught glimpses of more symbols carved into the walls, elegant swirls and patterns that seemed to shift in the moving light. The air grew cooler as I descended. After about 50 feet, the passage opened into a circular chamber. In the center stood what could only be the vault, a massive metal door set into the far wall, its surface covered in the same intricate patterns I'd seen in the tunnel. This had to be what Eleanor Pierce had worked so hard to protect. The second key, the one from the bank, matched the ornate keyhole perfectly. The mechanism inside the door made a series of clicking sounds as I turned the key. Each click echoed through the chamber like a gunshot. When the final tumbler fell into place, there was a hiss of escaping air, and the door swung open on surprisingly well-oiled hinges. I stepped inside, my flashlight beam cutting through decades of undisturbed air. The vault itself was smaller than I'd expected, maybe 15 feet square. The walls were lined with metal shelving, and in the center was a simple wooden table. On the table lay a single leather-bound book and an envelope addressed to me in my grandfather's handwriting. My hands trembled as I picked up the envelope. Inside was a letter dated just 6 months ago. Dear Emma, if you're reading this, you've solved the first part of the puzzle. You always were clever, just like Eleanor was. What's in this vault isn't gold or jewels, though that's what the neighbors always suspected. It's something far more valuable, the truth. The book on the table is Eleanor Pierce's personal journal. In 1962, she discovered something that would have rewritten the history of our town and several prominent families. But powerful people wanted it buried. They nearly succeeded. Eleanor trusted me to protect her work until the time was right. Now, I'm trusting you. I opened Eleanor's journal with shaking fingers. The first page contained a detailed account of her discovery, documents proving that several of Milton's founding families had built their fortunes through means they'd rather keep hidden. There were letters, photographs, and ledgers that implicated many people whose descendants still controlled the town. Names I recognized jumped off the pages, including Henderson. The sound of voices drifting down the passage made me freeze. Flashlight beams danced on the walls. I heard Mrs. Henderson's unmistakable voice. "It has to be down here. I saw her come this way." I quickly shoved Eleanor's journal and my grandfather's letter into my backpack. The voices were getting closer, accompanied by the scrape of footsteps on stone. "Harold always said Joe Collins and Eleanor were hiding something down here," Mrs. Henderson was saying. "All these years, right under our noses." I looked around frantically. The vault had no other exit, and I could hear at least 3 distinct voices approaching. The metal shelving lining the walls was filled with boxes of what looked like more documents and photographs, evidence that could change everything about how people saw this town. My grandfather's words echoed in my mind. Sometimes the best path is the one that scares you most. I made my decision. Instead of hiding, I stepped out of the vault and into the tunnel, flashlight beam held high. The approaching group stopped abruptly. Mrs. Henderson, her son-in-law who sat on the town council, and 2 other men I didn't recognize. "Looking for something?" I asked, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. Mrs. Henderson recovered first. "Emma, dear, we were so worried when we saw you come down here alone. This place isn't safe." "Actually," I said, pulling out my phone and the property deed, "it's perfectly safe. And it's private property. My property, to be exact." Mrs. Henderson's face went pale as I held up my phone, showing the recording app's active status. "We should discuss this somewhere more comfortable," I continued. "Maybe over coffee? I'm sure the local paper would love to hear about Eleanor Pierce's research. She kept very detailed records." The men behind her shifted uncomfortably. Her son-in-law stepped forward. "Now, Miss Collins, let's not be hasty. I'm sure we can come to some sort of arrangement." "Oh, we will," I said, thinking of my grandfather's cleverness in donating the house to the Historical Society. The perfect public platform for what was coming next. But first, I think it's time for a history lesson about Milton's real founding families. 1 week later, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters, historians, and curious locals all wanted to know more about Eleanor Pierce's discoveries. The Historical Society was thrilled with their unexpected role as custodians of both Grandpa Joe's house and the town's true history. Mrs. Henderson had stopped walking her dog past my apartment. In fact, most of the older families in town were suddenly very interested in taking extended vacations. I sat in what used to be my grandfather's study, now the Historical Society's research room, surrounded by carefully preserved documents from the vault. Eleanor's journal lay open on the desk, its contents already sending shockwaves through Milton's carefully maintained social hierarchy. On my desk was a new article from the Milton Gazette, "Local Woman Uncovers Town's Hidden History. Eleanor Pierce's Lost Documents Found." The photo showed me standing in front of Grandpa Joe's house, now the Milton Historical Research Center. I picked up Grandpa's journal again, smiling at a passage I'd read dozens of times now. The truth has a way of waiting for its moment. Eleanor and I knew that someday someone would come along who was brave enough to open that suitcase and follow the trail. Someone who understood that real treasure isn't about money, it's about justice, truth, and the courage to face both. My phone buzzed with another text from Katie Henderson. "Just so you know, Grams finally admitted she was wrong about your grandfather. Dad says our family's going to make things right, starting with a full confession about what really happened in '65. I looked out the window at the garden where I'd spent so many summers with Grandpa Joe. His roses were blooming, their fragrance drifting through the open window. The suitcase sat in a place of honor in the research center's main display case, a reminder that sometimes the most valuable inheritances aren't the ones you can see at first glance. In the end, Grandpa had left me something far more precious than a house. He'd left me the truth,